Hello. This lecture explores toxic stress. Clinically, toxic stress is the cause of our most challenging emotional disorders. It causes major anxiety and depressive disorders, and typically the combination of both. It is also what causes the brain to change, something that you can help your clients heal or change back. And from that point of view, understanding, treating, and reversing toxic stress or the effects of toxic stress is probably the most important job you will ever do in your clinical profession. It is also the basis, the foundation, and the bread and butter of this course, a discovery that will set you on a strong course in your clinical career. All right, we're going to start off by talking about what we discussed at the end of the last chapter, or what is stress. It's really important to know there's traumatic stress and there's toxic stress. And this lecture, of course, is all about toxic stress. Like I said, and I showed this slide in the last lecture, the terms anxiety, fear, and stress are used interchangeably. And you want to know that when working with your clients, is they may say, I'm really stressed. And you want to explore that further. What do they mean by really stressed? Usually it's a fear response or some sort of generalized fear response or something of that nature. In fact, I want to go to primary emotional responses to discuss that once again, like I ended up in the lecture the last time around. Joy is not a stress response, but fear primarily is. We're usually talking about fear when we humans are talking about stress and when your clients are talking about stress. The anger response is typically part of that too. People will say, I'm just really stressed out and I'm really short with this person or that person, because usually anger follows a fear response or a sadness response, but we talk about stress in terms of fear, of anger, like a lot. Sadness that can be talked about as a stress response by your clients, but normally it's a fear-related thing and maybe some anger thrown into for stress responses. In this lecture, of course, it focuses on toxic stress. Now, again, toxic stress is constant fear, living in constant fear. That's what we're talking about. Toxic stress is not traumatic stress, an event. That's an extremely scary event. We're talking about living in constant fear. I see it happening basically in three areas, or fear of abuse, fear of failure, and also what I call FOMO, or fear of measuring up. So again, to go into this first slide, fear of physical abuse is not just getting abused. That is trauma, typically. This is living in daily fear that, like in this case, he's going to do it again to me. I'm living in fear that I'm going to be physically assaulted because it happens once in a while, and every day there's fear that it's going to happen again. That's living in daily fear. The next slide is fear of sexual abuse, living in daily fear that you're going to be sexually assaulted again. This happens, like talk to adult clients who, as children, lived near a neighbor or some other family member who would come over and sexually assault them. And so just living in constant fear of more sexual assault. It obviously can happen to a partner that the person is sexually assaulting them often. So they're living in fear, daily fear of sexual abuse. This next one is incredibly common. It's just fear of verbal abuse. Now, verbal abuse can be at you and putting you down and all that stuff, but it can also be, and most importantly, yelling. It causes a fear response to be yelled at. And if you're yelled at daily, weekly, monthly, that is fear of physical abuse. I'm sorry, of verbal abuse. It can also happen if it's not directed at you, like in this slide. The parents in this slide are fighting and yelling again and again and again. And this child is just totally afraid because it's happening around them over and over again. And that is fear of verbal abuse. The next slides are about failure. And this first one is about fear of academic failure. And this boy is like just afraid daily that he's going to fail again and again and again at school. Constant fear, daily fear of academic failure. This is an example of occupational failure, living in fear of that, like your job, you can't do it, it's not working, people are just constantly all over you and at you, daily fear of failing in your job. This is about fear of financial failure, daily fear you can't pay your bills. That's what it's like. You could go through a time where, like, for a month, oh my God, I don't have enough money, I can't pay my bills, and so that's bad. But if you live in this kind of fear daily for weeks and months and more than a year and years, that's toxic stress, and that's going to change things for you in your brain, your body, and yourself. So the daily constant fear, the fear of financial failure. Moving then on to FOMO, which is like FOMO. So FOMO is fear of measuring up, which is like FOMO, or fear of missing out. We've probably all heard of FOMO, but fear of measuring up, I think, is the bigger issue because it's a daily fear you don't measure up, and that's especially online. And as this girl is showing, like, this daily fear that, like, I'm not perfect, I am not like them, there's so many things wrong with me, I am just not measuring up on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. Again, this isn't trauma. This is daily, weekly, monthly, yearly fear of not measuring up. And it's really pronounced in social media, as we all well know, and it's especially true for adolescents. Longer story about how adolescents, their job is to, meet up and merge with and become close with their peer group instead of like family so much. But then this stuff happens and it's brutal. And we're seeing the effects in anxiety and depression all the time. This next one is very closely related, or bullying, what's happening out there in the world for adolescents, especially, and adults too, but for adolescents, the bullying that can happen in school and in neighborhoods and other places, but online it's even worse, and that constant bullying that can happen online. Like one middle school principal said, like if a child in middle school drops their tray at lunch, before it would have been like, total embarrassment and awful feelings and maybe made fun of at the moment. But now with social media, it's happening all the time. They go home and it's constant. It's bullying online. So that is another daily, weekly, monthly fear that people, especially adolescents, kids, go through. So again, to make the point about toxic stress or living in daily fear of something, fear of abuse, fear of failure, and FOMO. I like the top three that I see. There are other things, but those are the top three that I see clinically. Now we're moving on to how toxic stress or daily fear, chronic stress, all the same thing, affects the brain and the body. So with stress, that naturally causes a number of structural and chemical reactions in the brain and the body to fight or run from the stimulus, the fight flight response. Freeze can also happen too, but fight or flight are more typical. And these changes happen in our body, in our brain and our body, so we can do that, be activated to fight off the threat or run from it. But that high chronic stress, that daily fear, not just an event, but a daily fear, that's what we in this course are calling toxic stress. And that toxic stress, that chronic daily, weekly, monthly fear, because of cortisol, a part of the stress response, changes the human brain, making the amygdala larger and hyperactive or reactive, while shrinking the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. Those things happen. Science backs this up. Science has found this out. This is what happens in the human brain typically from toxic stress or chronic fear. Which leads me to the slide, which I'll have many times in this course, of Big Amy, Small Hippo. Again, the nicknames I invented to talk with my clients about what's going on, what's happened. And by the way, Big Amy I use all the time because it's incredibly common. This is the most common emotional, psychological, distressing thing is a Big Amy and generalized anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety. A small hippo or shrunken or atrophied hippocampus happens. It's just less common. Again, we'll talk more about that in future lectures, but Big Amy, small hippo. Moving on to ACEs, which obviously is adverse childhood experiences. You've probably heard about this, maybe a lot. But it really was important to get us off the ground on this understanding of big Amy and small hippo and everything that goes with it. It was a study initiated in 1995 by Kaiser Permanente. It included 17,000 individuals. It's ongoing. It's an unbelievable study. And talking about the effect of adverse childhood experiences on children and their developing brains. And they talked about affecting brain architecture. And I got to say, as a clinician and as a professor, this really got me going, understanding what is brain architecture? What does that mean? What's going on for people? And then just set off a chain of events to do research and to figure this out uh, and go forward with it clinically and with you. Um, so talking about brain architecture, we need to start with understanding the limbic system or the emotional response system, because the limbic system is in the middle part of the brain and it's highly influential in our emotional responses. The rest of the brain and the body is all part of it. It's all one big thing, like that symphony idea I talked about before. But the limbic system, that is like the big player. And then within that, these two parts you see on the left-hand side of the screen, the amygdala, hippocampus, you can see what it points to there. They're like the really big players when we talk about the things that we diagnose and treat. Again, big Amy, small hippo, and they are part of the limbic system. Again, to come back to my major point here of toxic stress and how it changes the brain. It doesn't damage it, it changes it. And we'll get to that in a second. But repeated floods of cortisol, again, cause the amygdala enlargement and hyperactivation. But that cortisol also bathes the hippocampus to modulate the fear response. But repeated floods of cortisol over time eventually cause temporary atrophy. In other words, it can grow back, as well as a shrinkage of prefrontal cortex neurons. The idea again is like whenever we have a fear response, cortisol is one of the chemicals that shoots through the brain and the body. And it's all great for like running like heck or fighting like heck from the threat or being focused on what is the threat. But it's the repeated floods, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. That's what changes the sizes, the bigger Amy and the smaller hippo. And this is all due to the HPA axis or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I always worry I say that wrong. But anyway, HPA axis. This next slide indicates I want you to stop the lecture. Now go to the module and watch this video. It's a really great description. I just love how it describes the HPA axis and how chronic stress or toxic stress, same thing, affects the brain. When you're done, then come back to the lecture here. This slide is absolutely great to describe how stressful and traumatic life events, plural, happen in the brain and what happens there. So I'll just set off the things in motion. So these events occur, and every time they occur, it causes the HPA axis activation. Every time that occurs, it causes cortisol release. And if it happens over and over and over and over again, we get a bigger Amy, increase of amygdala volume, and a smaller hippo, a decrease of the volume of the hippocampus. That's what, like every time you and I have a fearful event, all this stuff happens, a cortisol release. But if it's happening daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, that's when the brain changes happen, the size. But every time it happens, the amygdala hippocampus gets activated for the purpose of success and survival. So again, leading us to this important slide, hoping you remember big Amy and small hippo. With my clients now, I talk about big Amy all the time, big Amy and generalized anxiety all the time, to help them understand and remember what's happened to them and what's going on. Okay, so then we get to this like question, like, why does this occur? Like, why are we built this way? What is the point of having this happen to us with a big Amy, small hippo, and anxiety and depression? What's the point? Well, turns out it's an extremely normal, healthy response to your environment. And I just simply say too many lines on the savannah. So it can be too much fear, daily fear of academic failure or physical abuse or anything. Anytime the fear response is activated, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, etc. So the idea is from too many lines on the savannah is like, let's say 100,000 years ago, we're living on the African savannah where we came from. and there's a pack of lions around us and they're trying to kill us. I mean, they've killed some of us and they're trying to eat us. I mean, we have a fear response like every time. It's trauma. But then it happens every day, all the time. We need to have a bigger fear response. We need to be hyper vigilant. We need to be completely alert and on guard to like, oh my God, a twig snapped. Are they out there again? So that's why we get a bigger Amy, to be more on guard, to be hyper vigilant, to succeed in our environment and survive in our environment. And the smaller hippocampus happens to modulate that fear response eventually because it becomes too much for the brain and body to do forever. But anyway, its evolution shaped it that way. And knowing that as clinicians help us explain that to our clients and help them get treatment to feel better, to change that so they don't have a big Amy or small hippo anymore. This next slide is great because I found it and it was like talking about um, dysfunctional or hyperfunctional. The idea is the same. Like I just said, they wrote, we propose that the amygdala in PTSD. Pause on that because they don't realize what toxic stress is versus PTSD. So most people talk about PTSD. And like I say in this course, that isn't what causes the amygdala and the hippocampus to change. It's not a fearful event. It's daily, weekly, monthly fear stuff. So anyway, causes the amygdala to become excessively protective or hyperfunctional and recognition of the fact that the individual has already survived in this life-threatening attacks, plural, like all the time, and another might be forthcoming. So you want to be on guard. And from the amygdala's perspective, a state of hypervigilance is justified because the traumatized person appears to be living in an unpredictable, hostile, and threatening world, or too many lions on the savannah. And that's why it happens, and that's why it occurs to us humans. Moving now to understanding levels of stress or levels of fear. This is from the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. So positive levels of stress are brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels, which is like feeling like really focused because you're like nervous that you're going to do something. And so all that fear response is like focused on doing a great job. That's what that means. Tolerable are serious temporary stress responses, like going through a lot of financial failure for a while, but you're surrounded by loving people. They love you, they help you get through it, they support you. And situation changes, it's over, then you're fine. Toxic levels of stress, we're talking about in this lecture especially, are prolonged activation of the stress response systems, like we're talking about in the brain and the body, in the absence of protective relationships. Now, I got to say, you can still like live through financial failure. You've got people who love you all around you, but still you're just constantly afraid that you're going to lose your house. So anyway, the idea of toxic levels of stress is what they're emphasizing here. In this slide, I'm going to emphasize like daily living experiences and our levels of fear or stress. Same thing. A low background fear, believe it or not, is driving a car. So we have to have some sort of fear response. You don't even feel it, don't even notice it, to keep us driving correctly on the right side of the road and watching out for other traffic and stuff. Got to have a fear response you don't even feel activated and working when you're driving a car if the situation's like that. A next one, which might be a medium and manageable fear, is public speaking. Now, for a lot of people, it's not. It's survival fear. It's freak you out. But if you're used to it, you get nervous, maybe kind of a lot nervous, but it's like a manageable fear. You feel it, definitely notice it, but it's manageable. And the last thing is a high or survival fear response, which is the lion on the savannah, which is you're driving a car and someone swerves into your lane and they just barely miss you and you go up the, and so then that's a huge survival fear response and it takes you off your body to come back to like normal. But anyway, that's the high survival fear response, which is really important for us when we talk about mental health, because a survival fear response leads to anxiety difficulties, challenges, or maybe even disorders. So I want to emphasize on this slide, which is a lot to cover in one slide. It's like worth a whole nother class, but I want to just open your eyes to this as to how this occurs. So a survival fear response from external stimuli, but repeated, like fear of physical abuse. It's a survival fear response from that fear of being abused again, a daily fear. That's what we call toxic stress, and it leads to generalized anxiety. A big Amy, generalized anxiety situation. Now, survival fear from internal stimuli is when we get panic attacks, which is like, I'm so anxious, and then you notice it, and then you get anxious about anxious, you get fear about fear. That's what a panic attack is. We're the only animal on the planet who has them. Longer story, but it's a real thing for people. It's extremely challenging. But even more challenging than that are having so many panic attacks, then you start to fear having more of them. And that's what we call panic disorder. And that is very treatable, but you have to have the right kind of CBT to treat that especially. But this is sort of like the levels of fear from survival fear all the way in the different sort of things that our clients or any human can experience at any time. Now, to finish up this lecture, I just want to finish up with some key concepts, which is, again, toxic stress and trauma. A lot of your clients will have had both. They will have lived in an environment of toxic stress or daily fear because of stuff going on, and then they're raped or they're physically assaulted or something happens, a trauma happens. And in this case, it's like they live through, just so much childhood abuse and everything. It's toxic stress and they got a big AME, generalized anxiety. Then they go to war and then they get shot at and almost killed. That's traumatic. And so that's toxic stress and trauma together. Many different types, but to know that is a reality for most actually of our clients. This idea of ACEs and toxic stress, I want to repeat the fact that adverse experiences can happen anytime in life. You could have a really lovely life for so many great relational and all sorts of reasons until you're 60, and then you live through at least a year of toxic stress and your brain changes and you're right there just like a child would be there from toxic stress. It doesn't matter about time of life. This slide represents it can happen anywhere in life because like down here in the Midcoast, Maine, we had a credit card company called MBNA, and we had so many people come to see us with generalized anxiety because they were living in daily fear of failure. Just the pressure cooker environment of that job was off the charts, and they got a big Amy. I didn't know it then, back when I was seeing it like a long time ago. Now I would understand that very clearly, but the idea is like a big Amy, a small hippo, toxic stress, toxic fear can happen anywhere in life. It doesn't have to be just like in a home with domestic violence. It's anywhere. The next thing to talk about briefly, then we're just about done, which is hi-fi kids and toxic stress, this term that I invented. This is like, it's kind of like FOMO. It's very similar, but a constant fear of not succeeding at the highest level. And I'm very concerned that millions and millions and millions of American teenagers and adolescents and young adults are dealing with this because like there's this unbelievable pressure for so many kids to get into Harvard or Ivy League or whatever schools, and they're just constantly, I got to do this and that and that and that so I can get into college, the best college. And that will lead to big AME, generalized anxiety, or small hippo. That will lead to that. It's, again, it's not trauma, it's toxic stress. It's not traumatic stress, it's daily fear. So to finish up this lecture, the classic slide to remember: big AME, small hippo. Toxic stress causes big AME and small hippo. Traumatic stress does not. It just doesn't. It activates the amygdala hippocampus in the moment, but it's daily, weekly, monthly, yearly fear that causes big AME and small hippo. All right. Hope this has been helpful, and see you all in the next lecture.